We are young, gifted and black, and that's a fact. Black power hammers. No, we say we call them trappers.
Trappers.
Black power trappers, what's good? Y'all know what time it is. Who are young, gifted, black. I think this time I'm gonna try to go like maybe 2 months without getting my hair retwisted. I'll probably still get like a line up and all that good stuff, but I'm gonna just leave it untwisted to give it a chance to grow.
It's growing a lot.
Yeah.
I can see it.
Black Power Trappers, y'all come on up in the room. Please put hashtag shared in the comments once you've shared it. Black Power Chikonde, Black Power Valencia. What's going on, comrades? It is again another wonderful Sunday. Y'all doing okay? Y'all doing all right? And we got a comrade on the line, Black Power comrade. Who we got on the line?
Kendrick, Black Power Kendrick.
Black Power Kendrick, how you doing, comrade?
Good morning.
Doing okay?
Yeah, I'm making some tea.
Okay. I feel like I kind of need to drink some tea too. Black Power Robert, y'all please make sure y'all share this video right now, because you know these social networks are, you know, like platforms are definitely working to censor, you know, our show, the Book Trap, and also we just found out that Instagram is now blocking any post that is showing support or expressing solidarity to
Samalini.
Samalini.
If I'm saying his name wrong, I'm sorry.
Yeah, who is the Iranian
general that was
general
just slain,
who was assassinated. And so, yeah, you know, they're definitely trying to censor, you know, our tools for political education. I mean, we saw this when they tried to take away the Black Panther newspaper. They tried to do it with Marcus Garvey's newspaper. And so now, you know, we are in 2020 and we have media outlets like Facebook and Instagram and Twitter. And these are the tools that we use, Black Hammer uses, to reach, you know, our people, the masses, to provide political education. So, of course, you know, white power never really changes its schemes. Like, they'll do the same thing over and over and over again, you know, to censor our speech, you know, to engage you, our people, in political education. So we cannot let that happen. So that's why it's so important to share to your timeline, share to your groups, and just share wherever possible, comrades. So we're going to go ahead and get started. So,
Soleimani. Soleimani, thank you,
Thank
Alex.
you for that, Comrade Alex.
And basically, I just wanted to say, based on what Dia just said, that's why we need our own app.
Yes.
So we don't have to rely on their platforms, and Black Hammer is in the process of making that happen.
Exactly. So if you know anybody with app development skills, or if you have app development skills, please hit us up on any of our platforms that you see Black Hammer on. That's Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. Even you can sign up at our website. If you have skills to develop an app, please hit us up. And I don't think we can really stress the importance of this enough, because I mean, like, you have this revolutionary organization such as Black Hammer and other revolutionary organizations that are working on the ground to, you know, build towards the liberation of African people and colonized people, that's doing food programs, that's doing school programs, that are providing political education. And right now, we are, to be truly honest, we are at the, we are at the mercy, you know, of these capitalist giants such as Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, who can just snatch these platforms away from us, you know, whenever they feel the need to. And it's a big thing, because these platforms right now, as they stand, provide security for us, the revolutionaries that make up these organizations. And this is our only way to be in front of you, to reach you. And if they take that away from us, then we as revolutionaries are left open to attack. We saw that with Corinne Gaines when she was on live, Facebook Live, and they immediately cut her broadcast, and she was slain by the pigs that had broken into her house. So, you know, this is why we need to have our own app. This is why we need to have our own social media platforms so we can continue the connection that we have. And, you know, we do local work, on the ground work in our communities and where we're located. But with Facebook, well, with a social media app, forget Facebook, but with the social media app, we're able to reach, you know, comrades no matter where they're located. And so that's why it's so important that we have our own social media apparatus. But yeah, welcome everybody to the Revolutionary Book Trap with your boy Chief Dia.
Chief Nyah. What's up with you?
Yes, and y'all know we here each and every single Sunday at 11 a.m. Eastern Standard Time. And as you know, we are right now in the middle of How Europe Underdeveloped Africa by Walter Rodney, which has been such a deep and profound read up until this point. And right now, today, we are going to begin chapter 4. But before we get into any of that, today we would like to thank everybody who made a contribution to the Atlanta Unit Homeless Food Drive, which is taking place next week on the 18th right here in ATL. Today, me and Comrade Nyah will be able to go and purchase all the items that we need for the food drive, and it is because of you. So we want to say thank you to everybody, every single person. If you shared the link, if you donated, if you talked your parents into donating, if you talked your family, your friends into donating, we appreciate you. And we got a change to our menu. So at first we was going to do, you know, sandwiches and things of that nature, and that was on me. That was my contradiction because I didn't think that we would have enough time to raise the money that that was needed. But it was a call made by our Commander-in-Chief Ghazi that we revert back to our previous menu, which was baked chicken, yellow rice, string beans, and dinner rolls. So we're going to be serving hot meals this time again. And so, yeah, today we're going to go out and get everything that we need. And again, we just really want to express our profound appreciation to you for making that possible. So again, thank you.
And also, we have some other Black Hammer events that are coming up. The East Coast has its Homeless Clothes Drive. It's going to be Sunday, January the 26th at 11 a.m. If you want to donate to that, you still can at BH East Coast. That's all together, $BH East Coast. And that's going to be in Wilmington, Delaware. That's going to be on the corner of 2nd Street and Jackson Street. And then also, Black Hammer Orlando is doing a clothes and hygiene drive. You can donate there at BH Florida, all together, $BH Florida. That's going to be Saturday, January the 25th from 1 p.m. to 3 p.m. Pine Hills, Orlando, Florida. If I didn't say the time for the East Coast, that's going to be at 11 a.m. But yeah, two great events that are going to be going on in those chapters. Really exciting and just really good to see us really serving the colonized.
That's right. And I see we operating on all fronts. We doing food and we doing clothing, so it's just lit. And I think I would be remiss if I didn't mention the trip that the Atlanta unit took to the gun range yesterday. Which was so fun. Y'all stay tuned for the pictures and the videos that we were able to take. Shout out to Comrade Terry, who led us at the gun range. Like, it was so much fun. And right now we're putting together the POA for the Atlanta Unit Gun Club. So if you reside in Atlanta and you want to participate in the gun club, please stick around for details to come. We got to lay out the POA, the plan of action, so we can make sure that it's organized and we have everything together. But don't you fret. We are working on it as we speak right now. It was just so great. I shot a shotgun. I shot a pistol. Like, that shotgun, I mean, the shotgun wasn't really that bad. And hold on one second. Let me show y'all something real quick. Excuse me, Conrad.
I've never shot a shotgun. I've shot a gun, never shot a shotgun. But I am really excited to do that because how bad is a revolution to know how to shoot a shotgun? Y'all, I didn't get to go, so I'm kind of bummed out because I had another meeting I had to do. But I saw them, and they were getting it on. They were getting, oh, and then he brought his target. Oh, man. You a natural, comrade?
I know, right? So I had to show, I wanted to bring y'all my, this was my target. Y'all see what it say at the top? White power.
Ha!
And we shot that motherfucker up.
I wouldn't have wanted to be that paper.
I know, right? But it was so much fun. And shout out to Comrade Terry, who is so knowledgeable. This comrade has a whole arsenal. Like, if you look at my Facebook story or my Instagram story, like, it's lit.
He has an arsenal of information.
Yeah, of information. Yeah. All right, comrades, we're going to go ahead and get started. So we're starting at chapter 4, which is entitled Europe and the Roots of African Development to 1885. So, how he begins his chapter is pretty much beginning with how the European slave trade was pretty much a basic factor in African development. So for the first half of the chapter, he's pretty much laying out, how detrimental the European slave trade was to the development of Africa. And so he starts with the first statement as saying that virtually, if you are to talk about trade in Africa between Europeans and Africans, you're pretty much talking about slave trade. Like, that's all. I mean, in the previous chapters, we did talk about, how Europeans, was basically trading like old guns, outdated, like materials and stuff like that. So we understood that those things weren't of any worth. So pretty much the only trade that was really happening in Africa at this point in time was slave trade. And he also talks about that in the trading of slaves before the colonial period, the majority of the slaves that were being traded with Europeans were captives, meaning that these captives came from African societies who were warring with other African societies, and the captives that they got, in terms of, the war and the fighting that they were going through were pretty much the captives that they were trading. And he says that before strictly speaking, the African only became a slave when he reached a society where he worked as a slave. Before that, he was first a free man, then a captive. Nevertheless, it is acceptable to speak of the trade in slaves when referring to the shipment of captives from Africa to various other parts of the world where they were to live and work as the property of Europeans. And before we go any further, Comrade, I wanted to ask you, what are your first earliest memories of learning about slavery? What can you remember when you were first taught about slavery?
I can remember going back to the 3rd grade. Mm-hmm. And you remember them American Girl dolls?
I remember them.
So I had gotten to the point where I did prefer black dolls. I wanted black dolls and everything like that. So all them little white girls, they had those American dolls. I didn't know that those dolls were really, really expensive. Mm-hmm. But the one black doll, her name was Addie.
Addie.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
And she was a slave. And so they had them in different outfits and stuff, but they came from a specific era. Mm-hmm. So they were called American Girl, and I remember some of the other names of the dolls. Like one was Molly, one was I forgot the other ones. But the little black girl, the little black doll, her name was Addie. Mm-hmm. And then I realized that she was always in like an apron. Mm-hmm. She was always in cooking clothes and stuff like that. And so I think I asked my dad.
Oh gosh.
For one. And my dad was a little more he was a little more vocal at that time about how he felt about white people.
Mm-hmm.
And he was just like, I'm not paying that much for them, you know.
Say it, girl.
We get blocked.
Okay, then don't say it. Don't
It's
say
the
it.
C word.
Okay.
But anyway, he told me about it then and said, you know, I'm not going to buy you a doll that represents something like that because, and like I said, I think I was like 8 or 9, but the other little girls in my class were like, well, that's the one that looks like you. And I mean, and she was a pretty doll, but that's as far back as I remember, you know.
Yeah. I think my earliest memories of learning about, you know, like slavery, I would say, yeah, probably started like in the 4th grade, and I just remember like going through these, like, I think we began being taught about it in social studies, and I can just remember seeing pictures of, you know, like slaves and, you know, in the books and everything like that. But the reason why I'm saying this is because for a major portion of the chapter, Walter Rodney speaks about, you know, like the deportation of Africans from Africa and what that did to the population of Africa at that time. And it was striking to me because in my earliest memories of learning about slavery, I never thought about I never thought about what that did to the population of Africa at that time. And further on in the chapter, he makes notice of that. And then just to see the numbers of the slaves that were transported and just the numbers at that time for, like, I think in the chapter he says that in one area of Africa, there were like thousands of African slaves being captured and taken to the Americas for decades at a time in like the thousands of numbers. And, you know, that to me, that's not something that I really factored in, you know, when learning. And of course, they're not going to teach it to you in that way, but that was just something that I had never thought about.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, he also makes mentions of, you know, Africans being sold to Arab buyers and how today we learn about that as the Arab slave trade. But he also, even in that instance, he does say that even though Africans were being traded and sold by Arab masters, this was still done in the interest of Europeans, meaning that even if you were bought and sold by an Arab master, whatever, you know, they instituted Arab masters over the certain plantations that you would be taken to. And so, yeah, he also speaks to how, you know, this whole thing, you know, and I think we was talking about it in a previous episode about how, you know, Africans were trading other Africans into slavery. And so he says that pretty much did take place, but it wasn't on the scale of what you would have to. It wasn't on the scale of which these European scholars would have you to believe. And he says that most of the captives were done. They were obtained through warfare, trickery, banditry, and kidnapping. And so you also have to keep in mind that before the colonial period, like before Europeans were coming to Africa and stealing African bodies, these Africans were captured, they were captives of other African societies and they were given away. So at this point, if me and Nyah are warring African societies and she takes my people as captives, she is not seeing my people as you know, like resources to her society. Because at this point in time, I'm her enemy. So, like, she doesn't see any unnecessary problem with her giving my people away to Europeans. So,
and then something else too, I can't remember if he re-mentioned it here or if it's somewhere else in maybe the previous chapter, but also in most of those cases where the captives were given away to other African societies, those captives could be reintegrated into that society. They weren't kept as slaves, you know, indefinitely for generations after generations after generations. Those captives were eventually, integrated into that society and helped that society to grow and develop economically. Whereas the captives that were exported to Europe and the Americas, of course, as we can, still see that those were for generations to come.
Yeah.
We're talking about however many generations it took to get to 400, 500 years.
And so he speaks about first he starts off talking about he goes into the number of slaves that were captured and exported, and he says a recent study suggested a figure of about 10 million Africans landed alive in the Americas, the Atlantic islands, and Europe. And he goes on to say that because it's a low figure and I like how he refers to these people as apologists for the capitalist system, because essentially that's what they are. And so he says that they use this number again to be apologists for the capitalist system. And he says in order to whitewash the European slave trade, they find it convenient to start by minimizing the numbers concerned. The truth is that any figure of Africans imported into the Americas, which is narrowly based on the surviving records, is bound to be low because there were so many people at that time who had a vested interest in smuggling slaves and withholding data. So, even with us understanding the number of surviving Africans who made it to the Americas and wherever, Europeans were transporting us to, this doesn't speak to the number of African people who died during this transition. And to speak to just the severity of that, when you look at take into account the great white shark. And if you watch National Geographic or any of these nature channels, they have this whole week called Shark Week where they talk about, sharks, different types of sharks and everything of that nature. So I can remember how they would speak about the route that sharks would take, traveling the seas to find food.
I know where you're going with this.
And what these scholars don't speak about and what you don't see on the National Geographic channel is that during the slave trade, the sharks would travel behind the ships in order to eat the slaves that either jumped off the ships, who had become sick, are the slaves that had died that the slave catchers were throwing overboard.
Yes.
And I say that to say that these sharks are still traveling these same paths today, expecting the bodies of our ancestors that were thrown over the ships during the passage from Africa to wherever the slave catchers were taking us.
Which is implicit to how many were thrown over. So it's not even just there was one here or there. There were so many that they had become accustomed to just being fed well because of how many bodies were thrown over. And it says here, that it said that the Atlantic crossing or middle passage, as it was called by European slavers, was notorious for the number of deaths incurred, averaging in the vicinity of 15 to 20%, and that's of the captives, that's 1/5 of every slave that was captured. 1 out of 5 died in the route to wherever they were going.
And then, so you have that, from the slaves being transported. But then he also goes on to say there were also numerous deaths in Africa itself and taking place on the continent between time of capture and time of embarkation, especially in cases where captives had to travel hundreds of miles to the coast. Most important of all, given that warfare was the principal means of obtaining captives, it is necessary to make some estimate as to the number of people killed and injured so as to extract the millions who were taken alive and sound. So next he goes on to speak about, the composition of the captives that were taken. And he says that the massive loss before we get into that, he says that slave buyers preferred their victims between the ages of 15 and 35, and preferably in the early 20s, the sex ratio being about 2 men to 1 woman. Europeans often accepted younger Africans, but rarely any older person. So he breaks that down to speak to, so if you are taking all of these young, able-bodied Africans, and selling them into slavery, you have to think about what that is going to do to the labor that is taking place right now in Africa. Because if you don't have able-bodied African women and men to work the land, to herd the cattle, the domestication of animals, then you are putting an immediate stop to the development of the continent as a whole. Excuse me. And that's only speaking to only one component of, the development of Africa as a whole.
I like when he goes into the fact that, we're trying to get a good grasp on the stagnation of Africa's growth, population overall, the continent. And, because there were a lack of records to show maybe what the population was in the 15th century when this was starting to really take off, but down here on page 97 it says no one has been able to come up with a figure representing total losses to the African population sustained through the extraction of slave labor from all the areas to all destinations over many centuries that slave trade existed. However, on every other continent from the 15th century onwards, the population showed constant and sometimes spectacular natural increase, while it is striking that the same did not apply to Africa. So Africa, first of all, life started there. Every other continent where there were people, the population grew. But Africa, it stagnated. And so even though they can't give you specific numbers, they can tell you that the population did not grow.
And just to provide you guys with an idea, he has this table that was produced by some European person or whatever. And so it says Africa in 1650 had a population of 100 million. Well, pretty much from 1650 to 1850, they had a population of 100 million. And in 1900, it increased to 120. Whereas in Europe, from 1650, starting at 103 million to 1900, it increased to 423 million. In Asia, in 1650, it started at 257, and in 1900, it was at 857 million people. So I mean, you have to and even he says that this table right now that I just read from isn't really accurate as it should be. But that just gives you an idea of the rate that African people were being stolen from Africa at this time. And he says none of the figures above is really precise, but they do indicate a consensus among researchers on population that the huge ass African continent has an abnormal record of stagnation in this respect, and there is no causative factor other than the trade in slaves to which attention can be drawn.
And even where you start to see a slight increase between 1850 and 1900, that is about the time when slavery officially ended in
and then
the
they
US.
they transitioned
So
into chattel
that
slavery.
correlates to that.
Mm-hmm.
So, I mean, wow.
And then on the other hand, as we see this population stagnation in Africa, he goes on to say, population growth played a major role in European development in providing labor, markets, and the pressures which led to further advance. So if Africa has a population that is stagnant, then you have no natural cause to expand upon your labor, to expand upon your markets and things of that nature, because you don't have population growth, so there's no factors for us. It's no environment created in order for us to move us forward in our development. And then he also goes on to say that African people were already, conscious of the importance of people, of us, of the population. And he says, African people were conscious that population was in their circumstances the most important factor of production. The most important factor of production. So if your population is not increasing, that is going to affect your production.
Absolutely.
And he says, among the Bimba, for instance, numbers of subjects were led to be more important than land. Among the Shambhala of Tanzania, the same feeling was expressed in the saying, a king is people.
Yes.
A king is people. Among the Balanta of Guinea-Bissau, the family strength is represented by the number of hands there are to cultivate the land.
So that was my read that back.
Oh, I'm sorry.
No, it's okay. It's good that because this means relevant to what we're discussing,
Mm-hmm.
and the fact that the ability to be able to develop your land is directly tied to the people that's there,
Mm-hmm.
and your ability to to grow as a population.
Mm-hmm.
And the people there recognize that there was a consciousness that we need people to be here if we want to develop the land, if we want to be self-sufficient, if we want to do these things. And so, yeah, I mean.
And then, so so he also goes on to say, for instance, when the inhabitants of a given area were reduced below a certain number in an environment where the tsetse fly was present, and the tsetse fly is it's a fly, but it's a fly that bites you, and it causes a disease. Mm-hmm. The remaining few had to abandon the area. In effect, enslavement was causing these people to lose their battle to tame and harness nature, a battle which is at the basis of development. So if there's not enough people in the area to devise a way or to develop a way to protect themselves from this fly, then those people would have to abandon that area. They would have to abandon that land. So that just goes to speak to another portion of the continent that was not able to be developed. And so he also ties it to the fact that how we just spoke about, the majority of Africans that were taken were captives, of other African societies that may have been warring with each other. He goes on to say that European slave dealers became the main stimulus for a great deal of social violence between different African communities and within any given community. And that has direct ties into what we see today. When you understand what a proxy war is, what happened in Rwanda, where you had all of these tribal, and even what we see happening now when you have all of these so-called African tribes that are killing each other, this is directly where that comes from. And we see that happening today.
And almost always, there's always Europeans in the middle of it for their benefit. I mean, just like we're reading about it right now. It was in the Europeans' benefit for these tribes to be warring at each other, and they took advantage of that to be able to dominate the trade that was going on between these tribes, and to affect their relationships with each other, and to make it easier to get captives for the work they were trying to produce.
So then he later goes on to just speak to like the different areas that, you know, the Europeans were getting, you know, captives from. And he says that the above changeover from gold mining to slave raiding took place within a period of a few years between 1700 and 1710, when the Gold Coast came to supply about 5,000 to 6,000 captives per year. By the end of the 18th century, a much smaller number of captives were exported from the Gold Coast, but the damage had already been done. It's worth noting that Europeans sought out different parts of West and Central Africa at different times to play the role of major suppliers of slaves to the Americas. This meant that virtually every section of the long eastern coastline between Senegal and Cunene rivers had at least a few years' experience of extensive trade in slaves, with all its consequences. There were periods extending over decades when exports remained at an average of many thousands per year. So decades, that's 10 years.
10 years each, yep.
10 years each, with thousands of slaves per year.
Thousands.
They were the leading forces inside Africa whose energies were otherwise, most of those areas were relatively highly developed within the African context. They were leading forces inside Africa whose energies would otherwise have gone towards their own self-improvement and the betterment of the continent as a whole.
And I was just going back and looking at like even the gold trade and everything, and then how, you know, if it didn't suit Europeans' material interests to do that, they even discouraged a certain amount of, you know, slave trade to come from a particular area because it undermined, you know, what did it say? It said it undermined basically gold, getting gold from there. And so, and they wanted the captives to, I guess, help them to produce something else. Let me read it, because it was just something that was just kind of like, so long before that day, Europeans accepted the fact that with their self-interest was involved. For example, in the 17th century, the Portuguese and Dutch actually discouraged slave trade on the Gold Coast, for they recognized that it would be incompatible with gold trade. However, by the end of that century, gold had been discovered in Brazil, and the importance of gold supplies from Africa was lessened. Within the total Atlantic pattern, African slaves became more important than gold, and Brazilian gold was offered for African captives at Whydah, which is Dahomey, and Accra. And at that point, slaving began undermining the Gold Coast economy and destroying the gold state. Slavery, raiding, and kidnapping made it unsafe to mine and travel with gold, and raiding for captives proved more profitable than gold mining. So they basically really had to find a way, you know, it's just, I just, you know, basically, I mean, these were just some brutal, savage materialists that really did not care about the conditions that it caused for the overall African continent, but only for how they could make it work for their benefit, for their material interests in Europe, which just severely underdeveloped, you know, the African continent.
And he says, to achieve economic development, one essential condition is to make the maximum use of the country's labor and natural resources. People are a natural resource, just in case you didn't know. Usually that demands peaceful conditions, but there have been times in history when social groups have grown stronger by raiding their neighbors for women, cattle, and goods, because they then used the booty from the raids for the benefit of their own community. This is what makes the situation different in Africa. Slaving in Africa did not even have that redeeming value. Captives were shipped outside Captives were shipped outside instead of being utilized within any given African community for creating wealth from nature. It was only an accidental product that in some areas, Africans who recruited captives for Europeans realized they were better off keeping some captives for themselves. In any case, slaving prevented the remaining population from effectively engaging in agriculture and industry, and it employed professional slave hunters and warriors to destroy rather than build.
So yeah, everything this is just very, it just keeps reiterating itself over and over again, how the overdevelopment of Europe and the Americas and the capitalist system was directly tied to the underdevelopment, the exploitation, the commodification of the African continent.
Yep. And I kind of feel like we just reading the same thing over and over again.
Well,
but again,
I appreciate the fact that he's laying out these very direct, acute examples, because it took we are reading the same thing over and over again, because they did this for over a period of centuries, and this is why you have these the European countries that are in the overdevelopment stage that they are today. This is why you see what you call third world countries who are still very much underdeveloped. They continue to do this.
And I don't want to say that in the sense that, we're reading this over, and I'm not saying it in that sense. I'm saying it in the sense that it just speaks to the truth of the history of what we're speaking to, of what is being laid out right here in this book. And just another testament, he says, during the colonial epoch, the British forced Africans to sing, "Rule Britannia, rule Britannia, rule the waves. Britons never, never shall be slaves."
The British themselves started singing the tune in the early 18th century at the height of using Africans as slaves. What would have been Britain's level of development had millions of them been put to work as slaves outside their homelands over a period of 4 centuries? Furthermore, assuming that those wonderful fellows could never, never, never have been slaves, one could speculate further on the probable effects on their development had continental Europe been enslaved. Had that been the case, its nearest neighbors would have been removed from the ambit of fruitful maiden Britain. After all, trade between the British Isles and places like the Baltic and the Mediterranean is unanimously considered by scholars to have been the earliest stimulus to the English economy in the late feudal and early capitalist period, even before the era of overseas expansion.
Okay, so from there, he then goes into breaking down these different arguments at this time that a lot of the thinking intellectuals for Europe and America were putting out to apologize, well, not apologize, but to be apologists for the capitalist system. And one reason he says that the Europeans used was saying that it was economically good for Africans to trade in slaves. One that receives much emphasis is that African rulers and other persons obtained European commodities in exchange for their captives, and this is how Africans gained wealth. It fails to take into account the fact that none of the long list of European articles were of the type which catered into the productive process, but were rather items to be rapidly consumed or stowed away uselessly. And it incredibly overlooks the fact that the majority of the imports were of the worst quality, even as consumer goods. Cheap gin, cheap gunpowder, pots and kettles full of holes, beads, and other assorted rubbish.
Yep, and I'm glad that he reiterated that again, because even when we did get so-called goods for them, they weren't of any use, they weren't of quality, they were at the minimal quality that could be used in African society at that time. So they didn't even send things that could even benefit their society. And I know we're going to get to it later, But I appreciate it when he goes into, even when Africa started to ask Europe to help build certain things, and how they were like, nope.
Mm-hmm. And then another argument is made that because of the slave trade, African people were able to be introduced to different types of food. So he says, a few of the arguments about the economic benefits of the European slave trade for Africa amount to nothing more than saying that exporting millions of captives was a way of avoiding starvation in Africa. To attempt to reply to that would be painful and time-wasting, but perhaps a slightly more subtle version of the same argument requires a reply. Namely, the argument that Africa gained because in the process of slave trading, new food crops were acquired from the American continent, and these became staples in Africa. The crops in question are maize and cassava, which became staples in Africa late in the 19th century in the present century. But the spread of food crops is one of the most common phenomena in human history. And we already know, oh my God, I'm burping so much. We already know that Africans were traveling to North America way before Europeans even knew what the Americas were. And I mean, even we see the consequence of that because stupid ass Christopher Columbus were calling the Native Americans, the indigenous people of this land, Indians because he thought he was in India.
He didn't even know where the fuck he was.
He didn't even know where he was. So he says, and just to expound on that context, because many people associate Italians with pasta. But even that's a lie, because the Italians took the idea of the spaghetti type foods from the Chinese noodle after Marco Polo returned from travels there. And then also people want to talk about Europe and you know how Irish people got the potato and how the whole potato famine and all of that bullshit, when Europe adopted the potato from the indigenous people of the Americas.
So in other words, they didn't have shit. Their land was barren. They stole from everywhere else like they always do. They were just a bunch of thieves who had no culture, and now they have this culture that everybody else is trying to emulate. Yeah.
It's all BS. But okay, so that's pretty much the first portion of chapter 4. Just and we didn't even really reach to all of the points that this brother lays out in terms of, you know, the slave trade being the basis for Africa's underdevelopment. So again, that is why it's important for you to get this PDF. I'll order you a copy and read. So next, he speaks to the technical stagnation and distortion of the African economy in the pre-colonial epoch. And pretty much he is speaking to like the technological development in Africa in the absence thereof of it. And so he speaks to how because Europeans were trading with so many other people, how their technology was able to be developed. And he says Europeans trading to Africa had to make use. Well, first he says that without Europeans trading pretty much stealing and plundering different areas around the globe, they would have had no technological developments. Meaning that they had to take materials from different parts of the world to develop their technology. And he says, Europeans trading to Africa had to make use of Asian and African consumer goods, showing that their system of production was not absolutely superior. So Europeans did not come, they were not born being some type of genius nation with all of this technological know-how and all of that other type of shit. He says it is particularly striking that in early centuries of trade, Europeans relied heavily on Indian cloths for resale in Africa, and they also purchased cloth in several parts of the West African coast for resale elsewhere. And he says, India is a classic example where the British used every means at their disposal to kill the cloth industry so that British cloth would be marked everywhere, including inside India itself. So not only did they take the goods from India, but because India was producing all of this stuff, they put an end to it, meaning that they took over their factories, and we already know the extent of British colonial rule in India. And I mean, even that's a whole nother episode that can be spoken to. But not only do they take your goods, but they come in and then they take away your way of producing it.
Yeah.
And it says, vital inventions and innovations appeared in England in the late 18th century after profits from external trade had been reinvested. So not only are they trading in other places, but they're taking the profits that they make to reinvest into their inventions. Into their economy. So you just have to think that if Africa does not have access to these goods, to the wealth from trading, then what do we have to invest back into the development of our innovations, of our inventions and things of that nature?
That sounds like the definition of a parasite. Just a real parasite, because all it's doing is sucking the life out of every other nation on the planet.
And he makes the point even clearer when he says African and Indian trade strengthened British industry, which in turn crushed whatever industry existed in what is now called underdeveloped countries. Through this process, Europe increased its capacity to produce on a large scale by harnessing the energy of wind and water and coal. European cloth industry was able to copy fashionable Indian and African patterns and eventually replace them, partly by establishing a stranglehold on the distribution of cloth around the shores of Africa and partly by swamping African products by importing cloth in bulk. European traders eventually succeeded in putting an end to the expansion of African cloth manufacture. Lord,
Thieves. That is their lineage. That is their legacy. Thieves.
And another important thing that you have to understand is that he goes, and this is where it gets real. This is where it gets really real. And he says, one of the features associated with technological advance is a spirit of scientific inquiry closely related to the process of production. This leads to inventiveness and innovation. During the period of capitalist development in Europe, this was very much the case, and historians lay great emphasis on the spirit of inventiveness in the English in the 18th century. Socialist societies do not leave innovations merely to chance or good luck. They actively cultivate tendencies for innovation. So just stopping right there. You have all of this wealth being poured into Europe and England and all of these different places. So that is going to create a basis for the youth of that society to inquire about science, to inquire about the arts, to inquire about literature, and in turn create more products to boost their economy, to build their society, to make development happen. That being said, so we just spoke to the composition of the slaves that were being taken from Africa at this point. From ages of 15 to 35, the youth of a nation is being stolen. So this whole component generation that would have been able to
help to develop. Yeah, these are the people that are in their prime that could have helped to develop the African continent had they not been kidnapped and ripped from their land. And they're being stolen, used as slaves to develop Europe, the Americas, and everywhere else on the planet, all while Africa is stagnating population-wise, developmentally, and can't develop, can't thrive.
And to deepen this point, just so you can understand the scale of which this was happening, He says, the German Democratic Republic, the youth established a young innovations fair in 1958, calling upon the intellectual creativity of socialist youth so that within 10 years, over 2,000 new inventions were presented at the fair. He goes on to further say the connection between Africa and Europe from the 15th century onward served to block the spirit of technological innovation both directly and indirectly. The European slave trade was a direct block, removing millions of youth and young adults who are the human agents front whom interventiveness springs. Those who remained in the areas badly hit by slave capturing were preoccupied about their freedom rather than improvements in production. Besides even the busiest African in West, Central, or East Africa was concerned more with the trade than with production because of the nature of the contacts with Europe. So that meant that you were more concerned about escaping the slave catchers rather than the improvements to your environments. And I had another point that I wanted to make, but I forgot. Go ahead.
That's just reiterating the fact that they have no choice but to be concerned about their survival. You don't have time or the ability to think about how you're going to further develop when you have to worry about your very survival. Mm-hmm. Just like we see today in most African and colonized communities. Mm-hmm. How are you going to think about going to school or anything else that maybe could improve your life when you don't know if you're going to be able to keep your lights on?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And just even really quickly before we go, another point, we probably all haven't heard of, what is it called? The phenomenon known as brain drain. And that's pretty much, okay, let me tell you what it is. So you have all of these Africans on the continent of Africa who not even in Africa, who have to travel to different parts of the world to become doctors, nurses, engineers, technicians, and things of that nature. And this is just to show that even the effects of what happened over the past 600 years has a consequence of what we see happening right now. Brain drain is, again, when all these Africans leave Africa to acquire all of these skills, but can't return back to Africa to impart these skills into the continent because Africa is not developed in a way for them to actually use the skills that they have. This is why we see so many African doctors here in America, in New York. People make light of it, about how, for example, the closest example that comes to mind right now is how Africans in Nigeria place so much pressure on their daughters and their sons to become doctors, to be sent out to America because they don't have an interest in remaining in Nigeria to speak to the different contradictions that our people are experiencing on the continent itself. And even that is connected to this whole neo-colonialist bourgeoisie type mentality. And it's so much so, like, my boyfriend has introduced me to these videos of this phenomenon that is happening in Kenya, and I want y'all to look this up. It's called jiggers, where our brothers and sisters are living in huts with no floors. Parasites are able to embed themselves into the feet of these African brothers and sisters. So much so to where they send these volunteers that come and take a scalpel to pick out the egg sacs of these parasites that are embedded into the feet of our people. And this is a direct consequence of African people having to take their skills elsewhere. And you better believe that all of this is tied to the same thing. It's all tied to the same thing. And I want y'all to look at, matter of fact, before we close really quickly, I'm going to post the link of the videos real quick. Hold on. Okay.
I wanted to say that I'm just thinking, like, I know a lot of Nigerian doctors that do live here.
Look at this. This is called Jigga parasite. And I'm copy the link. Let me see. And I'm going to post it here in the comment section.
Wow.
But I encourage y'all to take a look at that. And, you know, it's really only these real examples that we can show our brothers and sisters that's going to be able to light the fire under your ass to get involved in liberation, to get involved in the revolution. So, yeah. All right, so our next reading assignment for the upcoming Sunday, we were supposed to go into, so we pretty much finished up the technological portion of this chapter. So where we're going to begin next Sunday is the continuing political military developments in Africa. So this is in the same chapter, this is in chapter 4, but we're going to begin at the subheading that reads Continuing Political Military Developments in Africa, 1500 to 1885. And we're going to read from there. I think we should, okay. Dang, this is long. Okay. So we'll read from that, wait, let me find it again. And don't worry, we're gonna make sure, we'll put it in so we can let y'all know where we're going to go. So we're gonna read from there, the continuing political military developments in Africa, 1500 to 1885, to the italicized Rwanda, which is pages 131 in my book to pages 147. And comrade,
in my book is page 113 to 125.
Okay. So don't worry, in our promos, when we put it out, we'll definitely highlight the pages that we're going to read. But yeah, comrades, like, this is why I get so infuriated when you have these, you know, these white nationalists, and even some white, not even just the white nationalists, but white liberals who tell us that the past is the past, forget slavery, forget what happened, when everything that we have just laid out in this chapter has set the basis for the oppression that we experience today.
And their quality of life. Their quality of life and the way that they live and the access to the resources that they get, and they're being able to capitalize off of everything that we use technologically is literally still tied to everything that happened in the past and that's still happening today. Everything.
So it's no way in hell that we can forget. And it's our responsibility to, in turn, go back and research and find out about the past. Because that lays the context for the work that we have to, that lays the context for what our work now has to be. And we understand that now we have to make the masses conscious of this past, so that way they understand why there has to be a Black Hammer, why there had to be a Black Panther Party, why it had to be a Malcolm X, why there had to be a Martin Luther King Jr. And it's because of this history is why we had to have it. Because once you become politically aware of the basis of how your oppression was constructed, you then in turn become activated to unravel all of that shit and destroy it, so you can work to build a socialist, a communal government that speaks to the needs of the people, and not capitalist greed that we don't know anything. We don't know anything beyond the 600 plus years of oppression that we have up until this day. We don't know what it means to be free.
No, but that's part of the advantage of them to have it to where that
You
memory
don't
has
know.
been erased.
Your
Your very identity has been erased. Why would you, if you're conscious of that, which is why they don't want us to read books like this, because
why Walter Rodney was assassinated.
you know,
The author of this book was assassinated.
and so all of that being tied to the fact that the less you know, the less aware you are of those things, the less likely that you are to want to do something about that and to help form a society that really suits the needs of overall humanity. However, no one will be able to profit off of it either.
Nope.
And that's what they don't know.
All right, comrades, we're going to go ahead and get up out of here. Me and Comrade Nyah got to make it to the grocery store. But please, read. Don't forget to bring your hashtag. Read that back points of discussion. And next Sunday we'll come with a summation of the food drive because it's taking place on the 18th. And so until next time, comrades, trappers, comrades, Black Power.
And join Black Hammer today, www.blackhammer.org/sign-up.
Black Power.
Black Power.